Sexos en línea.
How do you respond to the two realities that everybody faces? You have this global interdependence, which you're linked to everybody. That interdependence needs to be managed. But at the same time, everyone's demanding more participation. The indignados in Spain, villagers in Wuhan in China. And any state that doesn't find that balance is not going to make it. If you get the balance wrong, you're going to have a crisis of legitimacy. Either you don't have enough participation, or you don't have enough performance. So a strong state doesn't mean the old PRI. Strong state means institutional capacity to take the long-term decisions and mobilize the society. Accountable meritocracy and knowledgeable democracy. Those need to be done. Manufacturing, as you know, is coming back to Mexico. Why? Because the average wage rate in China is $1.63, and in Mexico is $2.10. So there's not much difference when you add the energy and whatever. So manufacturing is coming back. There's a big opportunity for Mexico there, but the opportunity has to be used to make the middle class transition, say like South Korea did, and that requires a lot of things. And Peña Nieto, I think, has mentioned some of them he has to do. He's talked about broadband. He's talked about reforming education, because he's talked about reforming Pemex to some extent, because in the end, the real national patrimony of Mexico that matters is not the oil, it's the minds of the youth. I don't want to take this the wrong way. The PRI knows how to govern. It's a governing party. And Peña Nieto's using the power of the president right out of the gate to try to forge this consensus. If he tries to do it 3 years from now, everything's going to fall apart. He's got to try to pull it together now if he's going to fight the teachers union and Pemex and do all of these things.
And this is what our book argues. Governance is going to make all the difference. It doesn't seem that they've been in power, that they've opened up the economy at all. That's number one. Number two, Russia is physically a much bigger place than Mexico. It's a harsher place than Mexico, and it's two natural markets, if you want, on either side. China and Europe are markets with which they don't interact much. You have the exact opposite with Mexico. Well, the Russian government, since taken over, has withdrawn. The focus has been, it seems, empirically, on Moscow and maybe St. Petersburg. Well, we were just in Guadalajara. Guadalajara, I don't know what size it was, a few years ago. It's a huge city today. Mexico City is too big a city today. So you have, Monterrey has continued to grow. You've got so many cities, you've got so much that's actually grown, even with the problems that Mexico has had. If Peña Nieto is able to do half of what he's promising, Mexico will have a much better future than Russia. But it depends if the independent institutions, government institutions, will really have the power to do what they're supposed to do, and if the government that's in power is, whichever it is, it so happens to be the PRI now, is allowed to carry out its functions without being blocked.
Peña Nieto, by doing that, has understood, you talk about old PRI or new PRI, and it's too soon to tell which one it is. But he's understood that the PRI can't rule alone. That's one signal out of it. The second signal is that he understands he has to build consensus. Now, not just him, now the document may, I assume, as someone who was involved in politics in the past, when you do this type of thing, there's always two steps. One is you get as much unity as you can possibly get, and that's not always easy. And those things that are specific mean people really agree on them, and those things that are vague means you have to have room for negotiation.
In the past, you didn't have so many countries in the system competing, and you also have technology which changes the dynamic very much, so that somebody in Mexico can be just as competitive as long as they have access to technology, which they do today. They can be just as competitive as somebody sitting, let's say, in New York or in London. So the dynamics have changed a lot. So the competition between countries and frankly between systems now is there when it really didn't exist as much maybe 20, 30 years ago. So going back to the West, so the US is having an issue, and the West in general having an issue, which is that it's not growing that much economically. So the pie is one pie, not growing that much, and you've got, but the rest of the world is growing, is more competitive. So the West is under pressure to reform. Is the US able to reform? You've got two parties that are very much at odds. So it's very political, very ideological. So political, fairly short-term oriented, not a long-term consensus building exercise. You've got Europe, which has a problem of a social contract which has been wonderful, no longer affordable, but very difficult for citizens in different countries to accept the idea of changing their habits. In addition, to make it worse, the European, and this is very much the issue of governance, the European system politically is a system that's not viable. Sort of a halfway house is the way we describe it. You have a center which today is, trading, a number of different very sensible policies and one currency, but you don't have a fiscal center. You don't have a number of other things that make it function. So the edifice is not a complete edifice, so Europe needs to reform. A place like Japan has had a fantastic time, very rapid growth, but today isn't really able to make reforms, in this case, because it's very bureaucratic, and you've got a lot of stakeholders who are not willing to make changes. So the argument is a lot of the sort of more traditional, advanced democratic societies have real issues today. When you look at the East, let's say China, China has had an incredibly good economic time, but you're beginning to see enormous social pressures. So you can see that the system, as much as it has delivered for citizens, citizens now want more or maybe different things. They don't want just economic goods. They may want social goods. Can the Chinese government open up and give some of these social goods some, a degree of protection of the individual, more transparency and accountability on the side of government, some freedoms? Can the government, open up or not? A little place like Singapore that has been very successful, the government is getting challenged. Then you've got places in the middle, India. India has everything going for it in theory, but incredible difficulties, moving forward. We talked about Russia. Russia, it's very much a governance issue. So you've got challenges really around the world, and our thesis is that in the West, these systems, as accountable as they are, they're accountable to voters, but voters are now being congregated by political parties who are very much ideological, who are fighting for themselves, for the party, as opposed to necessarily for the nation or for the voters long-term parties. In the East, the opposite. The East needs to reform to be more responsible, more open to citizens, because they've been run really almost like corporations in a closed way. So they'll need to open up. We're not at all advocating that you go from a system of elections to a system of non-elections. We're just saying balance it out with institutions that are longer term in thinking. The old idea of having two houses was to have one house that is elected and the other house which is more meritocratic. The elected house has to approve everything that the unelected house does, but you at least have the capacity in the unelected house to think longer term and to propose things that are longer term. Today you've got two houses that do exactly the same thing. So actually they paralyze each other as opposed to helping each other. For the European construct to work, there's no question that changes have to be made. The political parties and political leaders in Europe, up to now, haven't had to explain the European project to their citizens. That's why you've got this paralysis today. They've avoided it so far. Now they have to deal with it. But there's a huge democratic deficit. Citizens haven't been engaged enough in something that was done very remotely from them.
And the problem that you have, and we discuss it in the book in the G20 chapter, especially with the G20, is the problem of legitimacy. As I said before, you need institutions that can manage the systemic links of interdependence. Now, when G20 came together under Gordon Brown, and basically you had a global stimulus program, essentially, which is a pretty big thing. You had a moment in which that institution was powerful, and it's legitimate in the extent that it is no longer just the G7, which can't provide global public goods on its own, and it's not just the emerging economies that can't do it, it's really the mechanism of adjustment. So it's a necessary body, and it showed what it could do in that G20 meeting in 2008. The problem is it lacks legitimacy. It's not democratically elected, it's self-chosen, but you need a body to coordinate this interdependence. So the idea that we had in the book is you don't have to think of global governance as some kind of a big world Leviathan government, right, that controls everything. This is the information age. This is the age of what we say interdependence of plural identities. That's not going to work. Nobody wants it. It's not going to function. So one way that's possible is these subnational networks on certain policies, like, for example, global warming. If you can't reach agreement at the G20 level or the UN level, at the summit level, on capping greenhouse gases, nonetheless, Australia, California, Quebec, some provinces in China, all have low carbon growth strategies and cap and trade where they can trade the carbon credits. They can trade among each other and create a market that reduces, which is essentially a carbon tax, even if the nation states or the G20 or the UN can't agree at the summit level. The Chinese middle class is the one that's pushing for freedom of expression, for rule of law, precisely to get the kind of stability you're talking about in property rights and everything else, not to have the arbitrary power of the state over them. So Marx said it a long time ago, Sam Huntington said it, that's the rising side. It creates, it's a political force. So China is about a middle class transition in many ways like Mexico. The United States, the middle class is falling. The middle class is being demoted. It's also a political force because all of the pressure for education reform, all of the Obama victories that just happened, or the rising middle, or the falling middle class that wants to get back to where it was, to restore where it was. And Obama's agenda and the agenda of the center left in the United States, why it's shifted from the right, is because that middle class is failing. So when they're rising, they're a political force, and when they're falling, they're a political force.
I think in countries like China or Mexico, that's exactly the role they're going to play. Meaning they are quite conservative. They want the economy to prosper. They want, you know, the ability to form a family, to have opportunities for your family, to have access to things, not just consumer goods, but you know, free time, you know, discover the world, discover the neighborhoods, all types of things. So the middle class is now, the US middle class, same in Europe, is being challenged by the more productive, maybe, comparatively middle classes of Mexico, of China, of India, that are actually, because they're fighting for a place in the world, they're willing to maybe work harder, invest more, actually save more than the traditional middle classes in the West. So the middle classes in the West, I think, have to reinvent themselves, and they have to find new ways to be relevant in a world which is much more competitive.